Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system. The customary quote. The stomach is an essential part of the chess master. From the Danish grandmaster Bent Larsen. Known for his imaginative and unorthodox style of play, he was the first Western player to pose a serious challenge to the Soviet Union's dominance in chess. A brief review of the last part, where we continued our study of Chapter 2, The Doubled Pawn and Restraint, Part 2 of the book Position Play, and completed discussing the topic, the most familiar doubled pawn complexes, and moved on to the next topic, Restraint, True and Spurious Freeing Moves, with illustrations from Nimzowitsch. So now, moving further into the book, Nimzowitsch continues the discussion under the topic of restraint, true and spurious or false freeing moves, and writes, the following postulate I regard as of the utmost importance. There is no such thing as an absolute freeing move. A freeing move in a position in which development has not been carried far always proves to be illusory, and vice versa. A move which does not come at all in the category of freeing moves can, given a surplus of tempi to our credit, lead to a very free game. Consider for instance the position on board. White has obviously a substantial plus in tempi, and in these circumstances the freeing move f5 only leads to a premature opening of black's undeveloped game. For example, f5, E takes on f5, G takes on f5, and knight h5, followed by f4 with a strong attack for white. This association of ideas was unknown to the pseudo-classical school, which knew only absolute freeing moves. Black's f5 in a position with a central pawn configuration as in the position on board was reckoned as such by it, and in 80% of cases was held worthy of commendation. We have reduced the proportion to about 60%. Or even after the defensive white move f3, after f5, E takes on f5, G takes on f5, and f3, the strength of the pair of black pawns at e5 and f5 must not be rated too high. Nimzowitsch writes of this position alongside its diagram as follows. Black's freeing move, f5, leads owing to black's backward development to a premature opening up of their game, which becomes in consequence compromised. Nimzowitsch continues, and now we certainly find ourselves facing the germ cell or origin of restraint action, to which, because of its importance, a separate section will be devoted. Moving further, Nimzowitsch discusses the next topic under the heading, the germ cell or origin of restraint action directed against a pawn majority is developed. The fight against a central majority, the qualitative majority. Nimzowitsch writes, I find it impossible to present the germ cell or origin of restraint by means of diagrams, so I will adopt another method. Black, shall we say, has a majority, pawns at a5 and b5 against white's pawn at a3, or pawns at e5 and f5 against pawn at f3. In both cases, black threatens to make a passed pawn, and in the second to attack white's castled position by the wedge f4 in conjunction with rook f5 to h5 and so on. The idea of the restraint now lies in the plan of neutralizing the enemy's pawn plus by means of the open e file and two different blockade points. In the position under consideration, Besides knights, halberdiers and archers, the possessor of the pawn majority has two threats at their disposal. The one lies in the advance e4, the other in the wedge f4, supplemented perhaps by the diversion rook f5 to g5 or h5, or pawn to h5, and so on. And at the same time, the establishment of a black knight at e3 will be planned. In what does the restraint idea now consist? In the case of e4 in f4, with an eventual bishop e3 to blockade black's e-pawn at that point. And on the other hand, if black should advance their f-pawn f4 to stop any further advance by knight e4. This knight, thanks to their radius of action, will help to make black's diversion difficult to carry out. It follows that we must look for the germ cell or origin of restraint action in an open file combined with a twofold possibility of setting up a blockade. A central majority must not be allowed to advance too far, otherwise the wedge threat would have a much too painful effect. For example, in the position on board, imagine any number of pieces added. Black with f3, the wedge, threatens to cut the white lines of communication between their h and g pawns and the rest of white's second rank. A white rook on a7 could no longer protect either of these pawns, and black's attack must, ceteris paribus or with other conditions remaining the same, be reckoned as very strong. Hence, it is necessary to fix an enemy central majority on its fourth rank, that is, with the configuration black pawns at e5, f5, white pawn at f3. The conception of the qualitative majority is an easy one to assimilate by anyone who has mastered the pawn chain. In the position on board, white has the qualitative majority of the king's wing, black on the queen's wing. That is to say, that majority which is more advanced towards the enemy base is naturally regarded as qualitatively the superior one. It stands to reason the further advanced a wing majority is, the sooner will lines be opened in that sector for exploitation by the possessor of the qualitative majority. Moving further, Nimzowitsch discusses the next topic under the heading number 5, the different forms under which restraint is wont or given to appear are further elucidated or explained. A. The fight against mobile center pawns. B. The restraint of a qualitative majority. C. Restraint of double complexes. D. My special variation and its restraint motif. Nimzowitsch writes, A. The mobile center pawn. White with a pawn at e4 against black's pawns at d6 and f7, or pawn at d4 against pawns at e6 and c6. Such a pawn can result from, say, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, d6, d4, he takes on d4, knight takes on d4, and bishop d7. Black's restraint operation will be begun by knight f6, bishop e7, castling, rook e8 and bishop f8. Another important aid towards the crippling of white's center is the more passive pawn structure, pawns at d6 and f6. The position white, pawn at e4, black, pawns at d6 and f6 is typical, and I call it the sawing position, since white's e-pawn is to be sawn up between these pawns. The sequence of events in a maneuver directed against a mobile center is usually number 1, the passive sawing position, then number 2, the more aggressive hindering action of a rook exerting pressure on it, number 3, making backward or isolated a once mobile center pawn, number 4, mechanical stopping of the same by a blockading piece, number 5, winning the pawn. The aim of the restraining party in a game may be sufficiently summed up thus: first restrain, next blockade, lastly destroy. To carry this out is difficult but remunerative or rewarding, and the process is instructive for the student. Hence, the analysis of the position reached after e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, e takes on d4 and knight takes on d4 is excellent training, and as such cannot be too strongly recommended to the aspiring student. The following illustrative game is apparently complicated, but only in its motives. In reality, it is a fight against white's pawn at e4 which dominates. Shoesmith versus Nimzowitsch, Ostend 1907. Hector William Shoesmith was an English chess player who played around the turn of the 20th century. Nimzowitsch continues. d4, knight f6, c4, d6, knight f3, knight d7, knight c3, e5, e4, bishop e7, bishop d3, castling, castling, and e takes on d4. If instead rook e8, then d5, and black will be cramped for a long time to come. For instance, knight c5, bishop e3, knight takes on d3, queen takes on d3, knight d7, b4, a4, apologies, a5, a3, and so on. As such, e takes on d4, knight takes on d4, rook e8, b3, knight e5, bishop c2, and a6. This advance will soon be intelligible. Bishop b2, bishop d7, h3, bishop f8, f4, knight g6, queen f3, c6, rook e1, and b5. Now the situation is clear. Black keeps an eye on white's e-pawn and seeks at the same time to be rid of the disturbing c-pawn, since the latter makes black's pawn at d6 backward. Queen d3, queen c7, king h1, rook d8, bishop b1, and b4, double exclamation mark. We are dealing with a chain formation, certainly rather an unusual one. The links of the chain are white's pawns at b3 and c4, black pawn at b4 and knight at c5. For why, as an exception, should not an officer be allowed to play the role of a pawn in a chain? The plan consists in playing a bishop c8, knight d7 to c5 and a5, a4, attacking the white enemy base, the pawn at b3. Accordingly, b4 involved the transference of the attack from the white pawn at c4 to his pawn at b3. Knight d1, bishop c8, queen f3, knight d7, knight f5, knight c5 and g4 question mark. A mistake which leaves his pawn at f4 insufficiently defended for a moment. But this short moment is long enough to allow black to break through brilliantly. Knight e6, exploiting white's mistake. Queen g3, bishop b7, h4, d5, e5, c5, c takes on d5, rook takes on d5 and king g1. If a bishop e4 question mark, then rook takes on d1. So king g1, rook d2, knight e3, queen c6 and white resigned the game. The reader may here be referred to my games against Teichmann and Blackburn, games number 2 and 32 of the illustrative games section. Please note that both these games have already been covered in this video series. Viewers who want to go through them again can find game number 2 in part 5 and game number 32 in part 39 of this video series. Nimzowitsch moves on here to the next part of the current topic and writes, B. The fight against a qualitative majority. Consider the position on board. We should then have a typical case of the restraint of a qualitative majority. If now knight takes on c5, then b takes on c5 and white's advance is crippled. If, however, a3 intending to follow with b4, then a4, b4, knight d3, and this strongly posted knight is compensation for a possible c5 by white. The student should notice that the action of black's flanking pawn is made up of equal parts of passive and aggressive effect. For this pawn, or the pawn at h5 in this position is the true prop of our whole restraint maneuver. In both positions, white's a3 or h3 will be answered by a4 or h4. Nimzowitsch writes of this position alongside its diagram as follows. White's qualitative majority appears to be held in restraint. h3 will be effectively answered by h4 and g4 by knight g3. Nimzowitsch continues. Another typical example is shown in the following endgame. See the position on board. Here, the advance in close formation planned by white, namely queen g3, h4 and g5, cannot be held up permanently. This advance, let us imagine for a moment that black's inevitable f6 has taken place, would expose the base of black's pawn chain after g takes on f6 and g takes on f6. But the king side attack involved in white's advance would be much worse for black. My apologies. His right plan will therefore be to hold up white's h4 and g5 long enough for the king to escape by flight. With this idea, black played knight h7 and then followed knight f3, queen e7, queen g3, rook e8, h4, f6 and rook a1. White too has weaknesses. Queen b7, rook e1, king f7 and rook e2. If g5, then h takes on g5, h takes on g5 and king e7 with a tenable or defendable game for black. So rook e2 and rook h8, the mysterious rook move. King f2, knight f8, g5, h takes on g5, h takes on g5 and knight d7. White's kingside attack may be said to have spent itself, for after g takes on f6, g takes on f6, queen g6 check, king e7, queen g7 check and king d6, black would have a splendid game. The game proceeded. G takes on f6, g takes on f6, knight h4, rook g8, knight g6, rook h5, rook g1 and rook g5 with advantage to black. The resource here demonstrated is worth the attention of the student. Nimzowitsch moves on here to the next part of the current topic and writes, C. Restraint of double complexes side by side with the dynamic weakness of such a complex, which we have often emphasized, we have to characterize the following points as often decisive. Number 1, the imprisoned bishop. Number 2, cramped terrain and consequent difficulties in finding a defense. Bird's opening and the English opening will give us an example of number 1. f4, d5, knight f3, c5 and d3, somewhat unusual. Knight c6, knight c3, bishop g4, g3, bishop takes on f3, double exclamation mark, e takes on f3, e6, bishop g2, f5, castling and d4. Delightful play. The bishop at g2 is now a prisoner in their own camp. Black's weakness at e6 is easily protected. Knight b1, b5, a4, b4, knight d2, knight a5, queen e2, king f7, rook e1, queen d7, knight c4, knight takes on c4, knight takes on c4, knight c4, knight takes on c4, d takes on c4, knight f6, and black, Dr. Edmund, dictated the tempo. Nimzowitsch writes of this position alongside its diagram as follows. The dead bishop g2, a prisoner in their own camp. The dark squared or queen bishop is in not much better state. Nimzowitsch continues. Number 2, e3, e5, c4, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6, knight f3, bishop b4, and bishop e2. Instead, to be considered was d4. E takes on d4, e takes on d4, d5, and bishop e2 with an equal game. So bishop e2, castling, rook e8, a3, bishop takes on c3, b takes on c3, d6, and white labored through the whole game under the difficulty of making use of his dark squared bishop. From the game Nimzowitsch versus Reti, Breslau, 1925. Two positions are given to illustrate point number 2. The latter, or the second position, shows us a blockading knight whose effect on the double complex is simply enormous. For not only is black's majority and its collective value illusory, but each single component of that majority seems individually to have its life threatened. Under these conditions, white's majority will win, almost at will. Even with rooks present on both sides, for example, white rook at a4, black rook at d8 or b6, the game would be untenable or indefensible for the second or black player. This shows to what degree restrained double pawns may cripple a position. Nimzowitsch writes of both positions alongside their respective diagrams as follows. If their pawn at c7 were absent, black would have freedom to move about. As it is, bearing in mind the threat, bishop b7, black is almost stalemated. The effect of a knight who is blockading enemy double pawns is crushing. Sooner or later, black will succumb to zugzwang. Alright, we conclude this part of Aron Nimzowicz's My System here, and we shall continue onwards from the next part. Here is a look at the recent channel support from my Twitch stream. Several new supporters: Arkin Gemma, hearfty, and Chess Guy 9333. Thank you for the kind support, everyone. Much appreciated. Alright, till next time, take care.